Hello everyone and welcome back to Scruffy Tales, and in today's video we will be taking a look at some footage from Ukraine involving a CV90. And it's kind of dramatic footage. It's a CV90 that takes part in an armored assault on Russian positions, and in order to reach the Russian positions, the Ukrainians have to drive straight through artillery strikes. And here you have the assault team, the assault force, with a T80 main battle tank taking the lead up front, followed by an M113 armored personnel carrier, and then you have the CV90 in the rear. And we're also told in the video that there's a second main battle tank somewhere, never shown, that is providing fire support and covering these three vehicles as they are pressing forward towards the Russians. And between the two transports, the M113 and the CV90, Ukraine could potentially bring in 10 to 20 troops in these two vehicles, roughly 2 to 3 squads, so around a platoon size element. All depending on how many people they jam into the M113, the CV90 can take 6 people. So here you have them, a closer look at the T80 main battle tank, and then you have the M113 APC. As you can see, it can hold between 11 or 15 passengers at most, and it usually comes with a small turret where you can have a 50 cal machine gun. So a pure transport it's not meant to stick around in a firefight and stuff like that. It's supposed to get troops to where they're needed, then either leave or stay behind to provide medevac and stuff like that. And then you, of course, have the CV90 infantry fighting vehicle with the 40mm Bofors automatic cannon. And this particular version that Ukraine is using can carry 6 passengers. And it all starts out with these 3 vehicles advancing along a road, hugging a tree line, as you should. You should never just rush out across an open field. You try and stick close to terrain features, because that gives you cover, at least on that part of to that side, and it cuts down enemy lines of fire and stuff like that. So the Ukrainians are doing the right thing here, following the tree line, hugging the trees as they approach the enemy. And as that happens, Russia is calling in artillery strikes, as you can see here marked with red circles. And there are a couple of times when they get really close to these vehicles as they charge forward. And here we have a bird's eye view of the approach to the Russian positions and the battlefield in general. As you can see, it's a wide open field that the Ukrainians have to deal with. Russians have set up shop in the forests at the top of the picture. And between the Ukrainians and Russians, there's a wide open field. And Ukrainians are being hammered by artillery as they are closing in on the Russians. They eventually get close enough to the Russian infantry in the Russian positions that the Russian artillery shuts down. They do not dare to fire on the Ukrainians when they are too close to Russian positions. So here we have proof that some Russian commanders are actually they actually have some tactical sense, and they won't shell their own troops, at least. And as this happens, we see how Ukraine uses tactics here. The T80 splits off from the transports and moves out and positions itself in the middle of the field. I'm not kidding, it drives straight out onto the field, on the open field, while the transports, they keep hugging the tree line, following the tree line to try and reach cover where they can dismount the troops. This obviously probably makes the Russians focus completely on the tank, forgetting about the transports. So that makes some sense. But the T80 is extremely vulnerable, even if it is a big tank. Vehicles in general should behave like infantry. The basics for infantry are the same for vehicles. Rely on cover, stay low, stay out of sight. If you have to cross an open field, you go it in a straight line at full speed. You don't zigzag or stuff like that or try and find cover. You go in a straight line as fast as possible from cover to cover. And imagine if you're infantry, you wouldn't be standing upright in the middle of a field, right? You would try and find a good spot and fire across the field. This is not what the T80 is doing. It is, in general, this is poor tactics, but circumstances might force him to move out. Maybe there's a slight elevation to the hill. Maybe it's actually a small hill, so he has to crawl up the hill to be able to find the ridge line and fire down on the Russians. That could be what's going on. The tank is also constantly moving. He's rolling forward, taking a shot. He's reversing to not be stationary, not be an easy target. So he is repositioning all the time, which tanks usually do when they are in cover behind the ridgeline. When they are hulled down, they move up, take a shot, they back down and try and come up in a different position, take another shot, moving back and forth. So that might be an indication that this tank is actually working with the elevation in the terrain and relying on a ridgeline out in the field to use it for cover and popping up where the Russians don't know where he's going to take his next shot. The beep beep beep, that was my headset shutting down. I didn't bother editing it out. If you've been around from the beginning with this channel, you know I struggled with the beep 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 back in the day, so for old time's sake, I kept it in. But here you have the terrain surrounding the Ukrainian T80. As you can see, it is wide open, and he is right in front of the Russian positions. He's not that far off either. What do you think? 50, 70 meters maybe? And he is firing constantly into these tree lines. He's even firing further back into the woods. That might be him missing a target in the tree line and the explosive round just going deeper into the woods itself. So, but this is what he's working with. He is out in the open, moving back and forth, firing at this tree line where the Russians are positioned. And you can also see, since the two transports, they are now out of view to the left of the image, you can see that they have a narrow line of trees to advance through in order to reach the Russians. So it's not ideal for the Ukrainian troops at all to be forced to fight through these narrow lanes. They're used to it, obviously, because these narrow tree lanes are all over the place in Ukraine. So this is how they have no choice. This is the battle. This is the infantry fight. You fight in these narrow corridors of woods because if you step outside, there's no cover and you get shot to death. Then this is strange to me because as soon as the troops are deployed, the two transports, the M113 and the CV90, fall back and leave the troops on their own. The tank covers these transports as they withdraw. The CV90 almost takes a artillery round straight to the top armor, really close, as they near the border for where the Russians are comfortable sending in artillery. The tank provides fire support as the transports fall back, and then the tank joins them, and with the turret aiming towards the rear, the tank keeps firing at the Russians. So Ukraine now has 2 or 3 squads of infantry on their own in a contested forest, which I find amazing, because even if there's only 1 or 2 squads of Russians in the tree line that they were firing on, the woods expanded outwards beyond that, right? It's a big ass forest. So what if there's more Russians in a camp further in? What then? What are you going to do with your 2 or 3 squads then, if it's not 10 or 20 Russians defending the tree line, but they actually have 40 or 50 troops resting further in a base camp? Yeah. So now you have 2 or 3 squads of Ukrainian infantry in a combat zone without fire support, because the tank and the 2 transports left, they don't have indirect fire supports, because we saw no artillery and no mortars hitting the Russians as the Ukrainians approached the enemy. And if everything fucks up, if everything goes tits up, they have no means to retreat except walking on foot through enemy artillery, because we know where the Russians are comfortable sending in their artillery, and that is where the Ukrainians have to walk through in order to get back to safety. So they have no means of conducting safe medevac. They are stuck on their own in this fight, come hell or high water. Doesn't matter what, if they succeed, then great, yes. But it's a war. It's combat. They could lose, right? There's like 50-50 chance that they will lose this combat, and they have no way of getting out of that situation. It's very strange to my mind. Now, in the video, we are a Ukrainian officer is walking us through the events as they happen, and he explains what's going on. So I will link the video in the description, by the way, so you can watch it on your own. What he explains is that the reason they are pulling the vehicles out of the combat is because they don't want to risk losing the vehicles, which, you know, what's the point of bringing in a CV90 if you're not going to be using it to support the assault itself? I get it, the M113, that is a battle taxi. That's not meant to be in the thick of it. The CV90, though, is not it's not a transport, it is an assault vehicle. It's designed to be in the thick of it. So all I can think of is that they're doing this because there's so many drones in the skies, right? If they stick around for too long in an area, the Russians will send in drones, and then they will hammer the vehicles and take them out. So Ukraine, then they rather move in the troops and then pull out the vehicles, having vehicles ready to support later on, moving more troops maybe, and so on. So that's why I think they pulled the vehicles out, even though it feels strange doing it as I watch the video. And because I can't help myself, I have to do a armchair general and keyboard warrior section dealing with the footage we've seen. And because why the hell not, right? I'm sitting here comfortable drinking coffee, have no clue what the fuck I'm talking about. So why not provide my thoughts on what happened, what might have happened, and what they maybe should have done? Yeah, because obviously I know what I'm talking about. Not really. Right, so very simple depiction of the battlefield. If we take a look at the bottom, we have the border for where Russia is comfortable sending in artillery. When the Ukrainians are moving through this area, they are instantly hit by Russian artillery. As they moved into assault position, they were struck by artillery down here, and when the vehicles eventually turned around and headed out of the area, again, this is the area where they were struck by artillery. So we know that the north, say north, on the map at least, north of the yellow line, they are safe from Russian artillery. As long as they stay north of that line, Russian artillery won't touch them, because then they are too close to Russian positions. Then we have the T80. As you can see, it moves out into the field, the wide open field, and set up a position, engaging Russians in the tree line. And like I said, the problem with having a vehicle out in the open, relatively stationary, it is moving back and forth, but it is, you know, a couple of tank lengths here and there, back and forth. It's still a prime target for anti-tank weapons like anti-tank guided missiles, enemy vehicles, guided artillery and stuff like that. So if you have a surveillance drone in the skies, you know, they will see the T80, and the Russians could then, okay, we have a T80 out in the open, fire, if we have guided artillery rounds, send them in. So you have basically top attack anti-tank weapons that you can launch with artillery. So these artillery rounds deploy 1 or 2 anti-tank weapons that look for heat signatures and or use sensors to locate vehicles, and then they guide themselves onto that vehicle and drop a heat round, anti-tank warhead, basically from above. So it's an artillery fired NLAW or javelin, you could say. You know, it attacks from the top, and which basically, if you hit, it's a guaranteed kill. Or if Russia has a vehicle nearby, you know, it could outmaneuver the T80, since it is clearly visible out in the middle of the field, and can then take a flanking shot, for instance, depending on what armament the vehicle has. So the T80, I think the T80 has made a colossal tactical mistake in doing what it has done here, positioning itself in the middle of this wide open field. And then we have the CV90 and the M113. The transports between them bring 10 to 20 soldiers. And you have 6 in the CV90, and what was it, 10 to 15 in the M113. And they move up to a safe position, dismount the troops, and then all the vehicles, like I said, fall back. There's nothing wrong with moving off to the side and finding a safe spot to dismount the troops. So I have nothing to say about that, because, you know, if you dismount safely, you can get your boys ready and everyone is good to go, and then everyone starts off on the same footing in the assault. Perfect. The problem is, of course, that the vehicles leave. Like I said, if things fuck up, then these troops have no way of getting out of Dodge. So they're completely on their own, and they are completely on their own walking through this very, very narrow lane of trees, like you can see in the small picture here, highlighted with the green box. It is very easily defended, this approach. And we don't know if the T80 was successful in firing on Russian positions. We don't know if the CV90 managed to take a couple of shots at the enemy as it was moving back and forth. So we don't know if the Russians are at full strength, or if they have wounded or whatever. So the Ukrainians are now forced to attack along a narrow path, a bottleneck that is very easily defended. And according to the officer that walked us through the video, he said that this assault was successful, so the Ukrainian troops managed to clear out the area of the Russians. So awesome. But as you can see, there are a lot of variables that could have turned this mission into a shit show, right? That was the mechanic calling. My car's fixed. Yay! And I'm keeping that in just because I want to. And yeah, so yeah, as you can tell, this could have easily been a complete shit show, a fuck up for Ukraine. But according to the Ukrainians themselves, at least, this mission was successful, despite everything else. So my initial thoughts as I watched the video was, first of all, there was no indirect fire support, no artillery and no mortars that I could see striking the Russian positions as the Ukrainians were advancing, which is fine. You don't always have those available, but it sure as hell helps if you can hit the enemy with the indirect fire to pin them in place and force them to keep their heads down as you're moving, right? Particularly mortar fire. Mortars are more accurate in this case compared to artillery. So you can use mortars for a longer period of time as you're approaching the enemy position, forcing the enemy to stay in cover for as long as possible, giving you time and options to maneuver and deploy as you see fit. Well, like I said, that's not always available, so it's not like I'm shitting bricks because there was no indirect fire. No. It happens. You don't always have those with you, so yeah, sometimes you just have to make do with what you've got. But like I've pointed out, the T80, there was no need for it, I feel, to move out into the open field like it did. If you take a look where I positioned it, it can still attack the Russian positions. It can still cover the transports moving, but it has its flank and rear secured. There's no risk of it getting outflanked. It can still fire at the Russian positions, and it can still move the turret around easily to counter any potential threats popping up at an unexpected angle. So the T80 should have positioned itself more towards the transports instead of moving out into the middle of the woods, in the middle of the field, where it was basically a very easy target if the Russians had any anti-tank capability present. And instead of the vehicles falling back and withdrawing, you could have kept the M113 in cover and use it for a rally point, and where you could treat wounded. You can even use it for medevac if you got 2 or 3 guys wounded early on. Pull them back to the M113 and head on out fast enough to make sure they get treatment and survive. And obviously the CV90, with its big 40mm autocannon, could have slowly advanced along with the infantry through this narrow lane of trees and just, kept pounding the Russians ahead of time before the infantry moved into Russian positions, their foxholes and what have you. So then you would have the CV90 and the tank both suppressing and providing fire support to the infantry, which would have made more sense in my mind, because that is what you know, CV90s and tanks are supposed to do. They're not supposed to ditch and abandon infantry in the fight. They're supposed to stick around and provide fire support and pin the enemy in place and force them to duck into cover, allowing the infantry to more easily maneuver into a position where they can engage and kill the enemy. And the reason is obviously, what if there are more Russians around than the ones you've spotted and seen in this particular tree line? Because you always strive to, like I've written here, you strive to attack with either equal or greater numbers than the enemy. Right? So you don't want to be outnumbered in a gunfight. So you bring, if there's 20 enemies holding position, you bring at least 20. And if you have a vehicle, it just provides all the more firepower. Even if it's a tank, you still need 20 guys to deal with 20 guys. You just bring a tank for that extra firepower. And, you know, it's a firefight. You're going to lose people, so you need to bring enough people so that you will be able to take wounded. You will be able to have your own people killed and still win the fight. So usually you want a 3-to-1 advantage in any given firefight. So it doesn't matter if 2 or 3 guys gets wounded and 1 or 2 guys gets killed. You still have enough troops to win the fight, right? So in this case, Ukraine brings 10 or 20 troops. So that means that they expect to fight at least somewhere between 8 and 20 Russians. But like I said, what if Russia has more troops in the woods, right? You don't know. 100 meters away, there could be 20 more guys, 40 more guys sitting in a bunker complex or another trench line that Ukraine hasn't spotted. And this obviously is a huge problem if these enemy reinforcements suddenly arrive on the scene and you're not prepared for it. And so that's why it's so important for these assault units to still have a vehicle nearby, to have a tank to support them, to have a infantry fighting vehicle with a powerful autocannon supporting the assault itself. That's the whole point of the IFV. The point is to stick around and provide the fire support the squads need in order to achieve the objective, no matter what appears. So even if a Russian BMP or BTR suddenly pops up, you can still deal with it. If a Russian T-72 arrives, then you have a tank or a anti-tank guided missile on the IFV able to deal with it. So abandoning the troops on their own like we see here, it just feels very, very, very strange and dangerous to the troops on the ground. Just to illustrate my point a bit more, if you have the T80 where I position it, it could fire well ahead of the main Ukrainian force dealing with the targets. Further down the line, the Cv90 could advance with the infantry and target enemies, let's call it medium distance, you know, so they can't move in reinforcements or pinning RPGs and heavy machine guns and stuff like that, while the infantry are slowly clearing out Russian positions, foxholes and trench lines and moving with the Cv90. And then further back you have potentially the M113 at a rally point where you can treat wounded, where you can have more ammunition ready, where you can even have water and hand grenades and stuff like that, so you can use that as a miniature forward base of operations where you can prepare yourself for the next push into the enemy. So you can always supply more ammunition, more hand grenades, and where you can safely and securely treat wounded, and also have the option to do a proper medevac, casevac if needed, right? This is obviously not what happened, but this is, I think, more in line with Western thinking, the Western approach on how to use these vehicles. in a combat situation. And should something unforeseen happen, more troops coming in through the woods, a enemy vehicle popping up, coming around the tree line, whatever, you have the tank, you have the CV90 ready to support the infantry. You have the M113 ready to rush in, pick up the troops, and you can all pull out before you lose everyone in the firefight that you now no longer control, and stuff like that. Like I said, this is not what Ukraine did, but I think this makes more sense. But Ukraine did not do this. They pulled everything out, and we'll explore why that is in my next segment. Fact of the matter is, I have seen something very similar not that long ago, about a month ago, when Russia attempted a similar assault on Klishivka, south of Bakhmut, a month ago or so, where they brought in one tank and two BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles. And they charged straight across an open field towards the town of Klishivka, suppressing the Ukrainians with vast amounts of firepower. And they moved up to the town, dropped off the troops, and then the vehicles turned around and left, leaving the infantry on their own to fight in the town. And in that situation, just as this one, we never saw reinforcements being brought in or any other troops moving on the flanks to exploit the fact that you were now putting pressure on a enemy position. And so basically what we're seeing in this instance with the Ukrainians. So why is this? Why have we seen Ukraine and Russia use the same tactics involving armored vehicles? Is this old Russian or even Soviet tactics on how to deploy mechanized infantry into combat? Or is it tactics developed during this war to avoid losing vehicles to drone strikes? So you move in, quickly drop off the troops. You can't stay because if you stay too long, drones will come in, find you and drop grenades and kamikaze strike your vehicles, and then well, the troops are still on their own, but you have lost the vehicles. So maybe you want to pull the vehicles out, preventing the enemy from destroying them, and the end result is still the same. The troops are on their own, but you did not lose the crew, you did not lose the vehicles. And in the end, I still have to ask the same questions that I asked when we watched the Russian assault on Klishivka. What can you achieve with only 2-3 squads of infantry in this case? You're deploying them and then leaving them on their own without any ability to effectively pull out of the combat area. Which means if you do fuck things up and you encounter more troops than you were planning on, and they receive reinforcements out of left field that you did not consider beforehand, what can you do? You can't do anything. You have no proper lines of retreat except running on foot through enemy artillery. That's not ideal. So I don't know. It raises questions, and I hope it is because it is the threat of drones. I could understand that. If it's not the threat of drones, ditching the infantry like they're doing, like Russia is doing, like Ukraine is doing, it feels very, very odd indeed. And you're not using these vehicles to their full potential. This is not combined arms warfare, what they are designed to do. They're designed to work with the infantry in dealing with the enemy, not just moving in, ditching them, and then getting the fuck out of Dodge, leaving the infantry to fight on their own, and everyone just hopes that the infantry does not get blown to bits. Thank you for watching. That's all I have for you in this video. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have any thoughts or comments on the tactics we've seen Ukraine rely on, and Russia for that matter, please share them in the comment section. I always find it interesting to discuss these things, and obviously, I'm not an expert. I'm just talking out of my ass. And if you think you have a good idea on why things are happening the way they're happening and what's going on, please share it, and we will all be able to read it and learn. And with all that said, I'll see you in the next one. Gå på marsch, Ukraine.